Hello and welcome to BCM300 Game Experience Design. This week we are talking materiality in the tabletop game experience, and I'm joined by game designer Richard Hall.
Hello.
How are you doing, Richard?
Doing just fine. We're going to get to talk about some ontologies.
We are diving deep into theory this week in order to explain, or at least think about and complicate the idea of objects, because it's objects that really distinguish video games and tabletop game experiences. Now, that's not to say that video games don't have objects, but they're largely virtual. They're largely inside the virtual world of the game space. And those objects that are exterior to that tend to be hardware. They tend to be controllers, mice, keyboards, consoles, that kind of thing. The level of materiality in the tabletop game experience isn't usually that technologically sophisticated. It's typically paper, cardboard, plastic, wood. Occasionally you might get exotic things like sand timers.
Yeah. Well, there's one of the wonderful things about this is once you start opening the door to what objects are used in games, you do have this like common pool of language right near the start, like a whole bunch of different game devices and game pieces that we're used to. But then when you start going to the edges, you see the wilds that stretch out beyond, where you get some truly off-the-wall things like the infamous game you play with sticks of pasta.
Yes, don't break the pasta.
Yes.
That's a really good one. All right. So we're going to start by looking at a school of philosophical thought that is concerned with understanding objects without humans, right? Without what we call, and let me see if I can get the word out first time, anthropocentrism, right?
Hey!
Thank you. That is understanding objects without privileging them in terms of their relationship with humans. Now, this is very difficult to do. This is what's called a metaphysical inquiry. The term for it is object-oriented ontology, and it's heavily influenced by the work of German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who was one of the big important philosophers of the 20th century, according to some. I want to point out that the idea of metaphysics is just the branch of philosophy that is concerned with understanding the fundamental nature of reality. It's interested
something nice and easy, like the fundamental nature of how things exist.
Exactly. It's concerned with the relationship between our minds and matter. I love the idea that humans are meat packages piloting bone mechs. Metaphysics is interested in the idea of substances and their attributes and the potentiality of substances, whether it be a grain of sand, a rock, a dice, or a central processing unit, or whatever. Heidegger is famously interested in asking the question, what is common to all entities that makes them entities in and of themselves, not in relationship to humans? In order to answer this question, we can draw on object-oriented ontology that maintains that objects exist independently of human perception and that they're not ontologically limited by their relations or other objects. And by ontologically, we mean just the way it exists. That's the simplest way to think about it. So, what does this mean in effect? Well, OOO, as it's often reduced to, ooh, right?
Yeah, they call it ooh in a talk.
Yeah, is really just a philosophical state of inquiry, right? It's about what's called speculative realism. And it argues against the reduction of philosophical inquiry into the correlation between being and thought. So you might be famous with the adage from Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. This is totally in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah.
And
I am despite the fact I don't think.
Exactly. Well, things are, even if they don't think. And I was recently having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about the idea of, what do objects want? What does a rock want? What does a candle want? Does it want to be burned or not? These are some of the kinds of ideas in speculative realism that come out of what's called a post-Kantian or Kantian, depending how you want to pronounce it, philosophy. So Immanuel Kant is another big, important German philosopher who argued that the human mind creates the structure of all human experience. So speculative realism is saying, no, actually, this is not true, and that reality isn't constructed by human experience.
Stuff gets a say.
Thank you. That's a great way of putting it. The term object-oriented ontology was coined by Graham Harman in his PhD, and he has a great book that's available on the web called Tool Being: Elements of Theory of Objects. And he's drawing on Heidegger.
Yeah.
His basic argument is that objects always withdraw from human interaction and other objects. There's a quote: "Even inanimate things only unlock each other's realities to a minimal extent, reducing one another to caricatures. Even if rocks are not sentient creatures, they never encounter one another in their deepest being, but only present at hand." So there's a lot going on in that sentence, but the easiest idea to think about is the table, right? You can only ever interact with a caricature of the idea of a table, right? You can put things on it, you can chop it up into bits, you can burn it, but you can never get to the tableness of the table. It's unavailable to you. As soon as you start to, put a table under an electron microscope, right, it no longer becomes a table, and you're looking at wood particles. And then
those wood particles become a network of molecules. Those molecules themselves break down into atoms, and we have a never-ending nested sequences of ever more fine objects that are themselves, none of them, tableness.
Exactly. And so this sets up some really interesting questions about what it is that objects do. And I'm not expecting anyone in the subject to be versed in object-oriented ontology. I'm merely just putting this on the table, so to speak. See what I did there?
Yeah. Nicely done.
In terms of setting up the idea of thinking about objects in and of themselves, rather than necessarily being means to an end of human interaction.
Hey, you know who had a lot of opinions about this stuff?
Who?
Our subject's favorite weirdo, Roger Caillois.
Oh, right. Yes. Go on.
He wrote a book called Stones and the Sacred, which is about the idea that humans are drawn to stones because, like, special precious stones, not because the stones themselves have any intrinsic value, but because there is a narrative the stones themselves tell that our brain deciphers from the universe.
Is that anything to do with why people like crystals?
That is, look, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case, but if Roger Caillois had been around for the 80s, he would have been one of the most annoying crystals guys. Yes.
I need to put a slide in on Caillois and crystals. This brings us up to Ian Bogost, and a book that you and I both know pretty well, yes, and we both like, called Alien Phenomenology: What It's Like to Be a Thing. So Bogost is contributing to this idea of speculative realism. And he says, to be a speculative realist, one must abandon the belief that human access sits at the center of being, organizing and regulating it like an ontological watchmaker. He describes Harman's approach as explicitly embracing the multifarious complexity of being among all things. Reality is affirmed, and humans are allowed to live within it, alongside sea urchins, kudzu, enchiladas, quasars, and Tesla coils. And of course, what he's doing there is invoking Bruno Latour and his famous philosophical approach in actor network theory, which is just to create liturgies, lists of things to express reality.
And it's worth knowing that specific action is itself fantastically difficult. And if you want to learn more about Latour, I believe the starting book you handed me was Here Comes Everything, an introduction to actor network theory.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Such a fantastic name.
So, all right, I put this in big capital letters. What does this mean for games? O, and speculative realism draws attention to the stuff of reality at all levels, not just the aggregation of small bits, right, which would be a kind of scientific naturalism, or the construction of human behavior and society, which would be social relativism. Games are not just their components. They're not just dice, bits of cardboard, plastic, paper, ink, rules, or their players, but the relations between them. And I want to underscore this point, right? Games are about the relations between the objects, and the player is just another one of those objects in that series of relations. Now, sure, we can prioritize it and we can say that's the most important, but I don't necessarily think that's true.
You could definitely make the argument that the player is the most complicated component.
But the player is just made up of a series of other components.
Well, right. I mean, sure.
And
a lot of those are interdependent and interconnected, and that's where we get to whole things like 3D brain structures.
But that's the game, right? The game itself is like the 3D brain structure. It is entirely dependent on those relations between those bits and pieces, which you might call the organs of the game.
I think you might have read my honours thesis.
If we take seriously the idea that all objects recede interminably into themselves, then human perception just becomes one among many ways that objects might relate. All things equally exist, yet they do not exist equally. Amen. So this view of objects and things offers us a way of thinking about what it is that we do when we make games, beyond the two poles of story and rules. It offers us a way to express a different kind of philosophy in the things we make. Now, this is hugely important, because in this subject, you're getting a sense of not just games, but all types of experiences as something that you can make for others. And the tabletop is really awesome, because it gives you an opportunity to experiment with your hands, right? To make something physical in the prototype with your hands, and to produce a thing that expresses your ideas and organizes these relationships between objects in order to communicate something. What does it communicate? This is the concept of philosophical carpentry. Going back to Bogost, this is the idea that making things is actually difficult work. And this is why we really emphasize that, when you're making your prototypes, that it just be paper and pen and cut up bits of cardboard and scribbled over playing cards. Because actually making the material things of games, and we can see some of these, beautiful objects in games, can actually take a long time, or a lot of money, or a lot of investment, or a lot of knowledge. Whether it's a table, a chair, a motorcycle, a software program, or a board game, simply getting something to work takes what Bogost calls vigorous activity, or carpentry. And I love this idea. Absolutely. This is one of my favorite ideas of Bogost's. And this is because carpentry is a craft. So making games is a craft. Mm-hmm. And that is because the carpenter must contend with the material resistance of his or her chosen form, making the object itself become the philosophy. Now, this is really important, right? Because designing an experience is an example of material resistance, because you might start out with an idea, but you don't necessarily end up at the place where your idea started. You encounter resistances. You encounter resistances as players meet the rules. You encounter resistances as you try to organize the odds ratio tables of your combat system, right? You encounter resistances through randomization. You encounter resistances through players interpreting the rules in different ways.
Limitations of your own ability to manipulate text, limitations of the tools you've chosen. Yeah. And the thing with this is, what do we call it when you have a bit of room to move around and you've got to test those limits, pushing back at them and seeing what kind of movement you have? We refer to that as having play.
Absolutely.
We are literally playing around in our limits.
And you're playing with those material resistances. You are testing them out and you're experimenting with them. What would be one of the most surprising examples of this in your experience as a game designer, Richard? Where have you hit a kind of material resistance barrier and that you had to go in a different direction with your design for a game?
So when you say that kind of thing, like, had to, there's always, this is the other thing, as a designer, you always have a whole bunch of choices. Mm-hmm. For example, I had a couple of games where the theme of the game actually provided a form of resistance where I decided, no, I can't just put this out there.
Right.
So that's an example.
Yeah.
Because for example, I had a game about holocausts.
Right. Tough
where one. I was providing, well, the whole point of the game is like, this is the measure we have for these countries, and we all recognize that's bad, but here's stuff Australia has done and here's stuff America has done. And the thing is, while that's very interesting and engaging, it's the kind of thing you can't really put on a shelf without being able to be there to explain it to people. So there's a problem. So that's a form of resistance there, like the idea of actual cultural value. And one of the other ones was, and this was brought up to me at a convention, where a player was looking through my games and they were like, I really like your stuff. I like how you talk about your games and I like the stuff you're doing. How many games do you have that can be played one-handed?
Right.
I said, I don't know. Why? And he says, because
Excellent.
I've had a stroke and my left hand doesn't work. And because of that, suddenly there is a door opened, and I realized that not only does this provide resistance for one game, but this provides a resistance for the infrastructure of all my games. Just being able to ask myself, can someone play this one-handed? What can I do to make sure that that's possible?
I also remember you talking to me about the number of cards in a game and how much that costs to manufacture, to ship, what kind of packaging it has to have.
Absolutely. A big order of games is about $1,000, and we need to make sure all that stuff. We need to make sure we're using that space as efficiently as possible.
Right.
Anything that sits in the house for too long is effectively losing us money.
Yeah. So there's all these different types of material resistance, and from the relations between that resistance at what comes out at the end is itself the object of the philosophy. And I think the point that you're making there about the one-handed play is exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about. Other types of material resistances, dice, classic. One of the reasons why Dungeons and Dragons is so successful is because it has non-D6 dice, right? It uses famously the D20 and then a whole to make tests. And so, and these are objects that you bounce on the table, and players will go to extreme lengths in buying different types of dice. And we've talked a little bit about this before. Like I recently saw a video about metal dice and the types of material resistances that are part of the experience of playing with metal dice, apart from just denting your table. Mm-hmm. Boards, Sorry, were you going to make a point?
I was going to bring up on the point of dice.
Yeah.
Do you by chance recall perennial favorite? I'll bring it up any chance I get. Rhino Hero.
Yeah. Yes.
So Rhino Hero has an upgraded version called Rhino Hero Super Battle, which is fantastic. It's still the same basic mechanics of Rhino Hero, but there is a dice you have to roll to see when you are placing the various items around the tower you're building.
Yep.
And the thing is, rolling the dice on the table unconsciously impacts the balance of the object you're building. You don't even realize it's having an effect.
Yes. Yeah.
Harbor are pretty good at this stuff.
So that's a great example of the next point, which is the board or the table or the surface on which you are projecting the experience via the rules and the materials. We've talked about cards. Rules, of course, offer material resistances. I have a friend who really cannot stand the fabric paper that the wingspan rules are printed on.
Yes. And that's not a unique thing.
Yeah.
We joke about forbidden candy.
Yes. So forbidden candy is a, there's a subreddit of forbidden candy of things that you shouldn't put in your mouth, and games like Azul have these lovely pieces that just look like they should go in your mouth. Like when we talked about, what objects want, they want to be they want to be eaten, but no, they don't. And of course, then there's material resistances between people. And you can think about this in an object sense, like with games like Werewolf, where you're actually asking people to close their eyes.
Yeah, that is really unsettling to some people.
Yeah. Oh, I find it unsettling.
As well you should. It's meant to unsettle you, but it doesn't affect everyone equally.
So Bogost says that philosophical carpentry first involves making something with your hands. Second, it involves a sense of things. That is, how things fashion one another and the world at large. Now, this is a really great point. He says, consider how a cabinet maker contributes to the storing and presentation of objects. This is something that we don't think about a lot when you go into a retail space. But usually when you go into a retail space, a lot of those cabinets, a lot of those, shelving presentation spaces are actually made to order, right? They're often not just standard off the shelf type things.
Yeah, they are specific for this project.
Exactly, and I love this example of these handles as being right. So the cabinet maker is contributing to how we understand those objects. The board is another example of this, right? The board is a very much a framing object for how we understand the relationship between objects in the game. And that's why I love kind of board games that are non-standard board games. There's a board game called Inish that has these wonky, like large, big, chunky pieces that fit together. Takenoko and, of course, Settlers of Catan have hexes that fit together. These actually contribute, the object relations between these things contribute to how we understand the game itself. Bogost says, philosophical carpentry then entails making things that explain how things make their world. This is the kind of point that I want to get to, right? So how does Monopoly, the classic example, right?
Will we take a chance to jab at Monopoly? Will we ever?
But how does Monopoly explain how those things make their world, right? The relationship of the roll and move, the squares, the tiles, the pieces, the hotels, the money. How does this make the world? What is it communicating in that world?
And just the fact that, for example, in Monopoly, the pieces are representational not of people, but of things people have. That means that the player objects are themselves saying not just abstract to a tiny little person, but abstract even further. You aren't looking at the person. You know nothing about the person. We're not going to represent them, but you have a top hat.
I've got
I know it sounds so weird.
The top hat, yeah. Or the thimble.
Yeah, because the thimble used to be a representation of hardworking poverty. Yeah. A person who owned a thimble repaired their own clothes.
So I've got Cards Against Humanity as an example here because I wanted an example that didn't have a lot of obvious material things, but it helps us to think about words as material things. So for those of you that haven't played, Cards Against Humanity
based on the reports we're getting, is none of you.
Cards Against Humanity is a party game in which players complete fill in the blank statements using words or phrases that are, usually, quite often, deemed as offensive. The philosophical carpentry of the game brings attention to the way these words are produced as risque or politically incorrect. The object calls into attention its own objectivity. In this case, the words themselves call into question that they are a product of culture, and they require the player to enact positions of enunciation that would otherwise transgress social norms. You're allowed to, by happenstance, bring together these words and ideas that might be offensive in the game, because the game divorces the real world consequences from the combinations of the game materials. The game divorces the player from the consequence of the utterance, and thereby, in doing that, reveals the social construction of its offensiveness. So, what I'm saying is there that the words on the cards by themselves are harmless. And it is only in what we bring to those cards that we understand, just how objectionable some of these ideas can be. But that's not the words, that's not the cards, that's not the material elements doing that, but they are drawing attention to that complication. Cards Against Humanity has on the box, right, a party game for horrible people.
That box is itself part of the game. The fact that it frames itself as with that approach is what the box is there to do. The same thing is true of rule books and box liners and even advertising cards that seem to be for unrelated things. These elements all go into making up the object that you are dealing with the game and that you as a player are enacting. If the box of Cards Against Humanity had a tagline on it of, say, please be nice, there would be a distinctly different mindset going into it, as opposed to, let's face it, a lot of people go into Cards Against Humanity going, what's the most racist thing I can make this game do? And then say, oh, it was the game, because we are literally making you play with that space.
But and in reality, the game is actually pointing to the inverse. That no, it's not the words themselves; it's the meanings that you're bringing to the words.
Yeah,
and there's a good example. Fantasy Flight do this a lot, but Smash Up. When you open the game, there's only 2 decks of cards, but there's a plastic container with slots, right? And it's literally saying to you that this box wants to be filled with more products that you can go out and buy and put in this box. It is framing that experience through a very simple plastic structure. It's quite clever, really, because you open the box and you're like, oh, the poor thing, it's empty. We need to fill it up, otherwise it won't be happy.
This is a thing that video games actually can do really cleverly with interface.
Yes.
When you, for example, when you first get an inventory and you open it up and there's like 10 slots in there and you've got 3 objects, it just very instantly goes, oh, there's going to be at least 7 more things. And some games have messed with that. There are some games with interfaces where there are slots for things that you never get and never will fulfill.
But that's the speculative realism. That's where this object is saying, you need to go and fill me, otherwise I'm not complete. But it's as you say, an interface. We've talked about Twilight Struggle before, but I just think it's a really great example of a game that has a high materiality, in that it has all these pieces, but it does a fantastic job of never reducing either the US or the USSR to the bad guy.
Yeah.
It's using its materiality to show a structural relations and tensions about these two superpowers at a time in the world where, you know, we imagined that at any time we could enter into a nuclear war, a hot war.
And this comes through even in the structural level of the game itself.
Yeah.
Note if you look at the board, the USA and USSR have no spaces inside those countries. Everything there is externalized from those sources. So you have this giant chunk of real estate on this game board that is not being used for anything but to highlight, no, you don't get a say here.
Yes. So clever. So very clever. I really like that game.
And the box art for Twilight Struggle also deserves special mention because there are like it's so very good. It's stark, it's crisp, it uses very distinct colors and shapes, but also the grid between them, making the space between the two fences into literally a game board.
And a chess game.
Yeah.
You know, implying some kind of clever struggle.
And indeed, it's called a struggle because struggles aren't easy. Struggles don't have decisive winners. Struggles are straining and wriggling and trying. There's a lot of stuff we associate with struggling that isn't what we conventionally can see with games of victory.
But that struggle, as you were pointing out, is not internal to these nation states of USSR. It's a struggle being carried out on a world stage through these material elements.
Yeah, you basically have two enormous things grinding against each other, and the game very much puts you in position of being stuck between them.
So another game that I think does this kind of thing so well is Photosynthesis. I'm such a big fan of this game.
Let's be a tree.
Yes, kind of. So Photosynthesis is by Blue Orange. You can see on screen just how beautiful it is. I just love the fact that these really great tree pieces come just in thick cardboard and you punch them out and you slot them in together. It's like the most basic crafting you do as a kid to learn to make a standee by cutting a slot in the bottom of something and sticking it together. It's so super clever. The box itself is magical because it's so well organized. So Photosynthesis was designed by Hjalmar Huck and Hjalmar, thank you, and Sabrina Miramont, and it was published in 2017. On first appearance, right, the idea of the word, right, photosynthesis, sounds like it's meant to teach players about plant growth, right? It implies the science of how plants produce oxygen by consuming water and carbon dioxide. But as you play the game, the material relationships between the trees, between the location of the sun, between the density of the forest, between the seedlings and the actions that you take, reveal that the game itself is simply about the relations between plants themselves and how plants have to negotiate between themselves over the limitations of space in order to thrive. It is cleverness in a box, I swear it.
Also, as we're talking about values as implied by objects,
yes,
every component of photosynthesis is recyclable.
Thank you. I hadn't thought of that.
It's a note in the box. Like if you get to the bottom of the box and there's a little note that says, hey, we're doing things this way because we want to make sure that we're not producing plastic waste in our game about trees.
Now, it does teach us, right? So there is a relationship to us. But the philosophical carpentry comes from the relations between the materials, which are enacting the relations between plants that do not involve humans in any way. And I just, if there were rewards for philosophical carpentry, photosynthesis would be right up there.
It's a real galaxy brain game, especially because we talk about how games impart values and how basically this object has a philosophy. This object's philosophy is to think like trees behave. There is a
Yes.
brain implied by the way trees grow, even if we know for a fact it is not being done with intention. And that's something this game lets you inhabit, and that's absolutely amazing.
So when we think of desire and want, we're often stuck in our understanding of humans because we desire and want. But a tree wants things. It wants to grow. It wants to propagate. It wants to photosynthesize. And none of that involves humans in any way. And so we can learn from that relationship without actually being part of the network of relations that are being explained. So heading towards the end here, but I've just got a couple more examples I want to go through, because Carpentry argues Bogost is philosophical lab equipment. It may serve productive, narrative, entertainment, and aesthetic purpose, but it is constructed as a theory, as a question, as an experiment. Another one of my favorites that does this, I think, really well is Terraforming Mars. And you can see from the example, right, this is amazing object relations between these little hex squares, these little cubes that you place on them. Yes, it's embodying the idea that we have to terraform Mars in order to live there. But there's a set of material relations that, in terms of the heat of the planet, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. Yes, it's all directed at what humans need, but it's still teaching you something about that because of those object relations. Have you played this next one? I've been reading a bit about it. It's called Nova Luna.
No, this one's totally new to me.
It
looks beautiful, but also looks Terra Mystica-ish. This looks like it's an absolute tree in a box.
It's described as an abstract game, but it really just has this theme.
It doesn't look it.
No, it has this theme of the lunar cycle, and just the lunar cycle, which occurs. I mean, yes, you can see the human faces on the moon. So these aren't these aren't the same as photosynthesis. These are all implying human relations in their materiality. And of course, this one is actually implying a kind of anthropomorphism of the moon itself. But I've ordered this game. I'm gonna play with it.
I look forward to this.
Meeple Circus. This one of the things that we don't have. I've lamented this for years, and I haven't done much about it. Is that we don't have a lot of manual dexterity games. And I think it's important that we get some, because they encapsulate this idea of philosophical carpentry through objects. Because yes, there is a circus theme, right? That's kind of cool. But at a much deeper level, there is a theme about the material relations of these objects that you have to stack on one another. And some objects don't want to be stacked on other objects, and some objects work really well when they're stacked on other objects. And so
there is both resistance and compliance in the nature of the object, and how you make those objects relate to one another creates new stages of compliance and resistance. It is an emergence of the object's intention, creating a new object that has new intentions.
Beautifully said. Absolutely. All right. I just want to kind of throw out some provocations before we finish up, and this might help you think about your independent game project, but also your group project and what it's doing. And this is an idea from Bogost as well. The idea that we use language to describe the experience of things, but it is not the only tool we have. Games can make powerful machines that can replicate and communicate the operation of an object's experience. So these are some of the ideas that I had. How might we communicate the physics of carbon sequestration in the ocean? How might we make a game that includes the experience of gravity between the planets in the solar system, and make that fun? Like how would you do that? How would you build objects that communicate the danger of domestic felines and the threat they pose to native marsupials and birds?
I skipped this slide and I'm fizzing.
How could you create a game that can communicate or get us to think about how a smart home of the future will think? So these are all just kind of provocations that I thought I would like to make games about.
I have thoughts on all of these, and if you come to me after the lecture and talk to me about them, I will absolutely bear that in mind when time comes to mark you, because this is super interesting.
Thanks, Richard. Philosophical carpentry does not have to be complex. Please keep that in mind. I think the Meeple balancing is a great idea. It's a simple, very simple idea of different shapes balancing on top of one another. But they merely have to help to render the relationship between objects and objects outside of their connection to human senses. That's where I think that they're most effective. And you can put Photoshop into that category. All right.
Yeah.
We did it. We're at the end. Once again, I want to thank Richard for joining me on this voyage. This has been a deep dive into some quite important philosophical territory in terms of the tabletop game experience.
And I did it without insulting Heidegger.
Yes, we'll get to that in the tutorials.
Big asterisk on that one.
So don't forget to play more games, and we will see you next time.
Aiden, thank you very much for your time, students.
Bye-bye.
Bye.